Nia Brooks didn't think, she just reacted. The sound of the impact echoed through the room before she even realized what she had done. Her hand was still suspended in the air, trembling, while in front of her the body recoiled, the look shocked, hurt, disbelieving. The silence that followed was worse than any scream, her breathing was heavy, uneven, and for a moment she didn't know if she was afraid of the other person, or of herself behind her. A wheelchair. A face mark. A look that begged for something that could no longer be ignored. And in that instant she understood. There was no going back. Whatever happened next would change everything. 3 people in the room. 3 versions of the truth, and only one chance to decide who was right. But this wasn't the first difficult choice Nia Brooks had ever made. For months earlier, she stood at the entrance of a place that didn't seem to belong to the same world as her. A space too large, too quiet, too perfect. Her hands gripped the strap of her simple suitcase tightly, as if it were the only stable thing in the middle of the unknown. She didn't come just for a job. She came because she knew how to care for people. That was the only reason that mattered to her. It was what she had learned her whole life. When the door opened, the air changed. Places like that always carry something invisible. Unspoken rules, judging looks, silences that say more than words. She noticed it immediately. Her eyes scanned every detail, not out of curiosity but out of instinct. Something about that place felt contained. Like everything was too organized to hide something. Then she saw her. A figure sitting still, quiet, as if she had been there for a long time, waiting for someone who never came. The first look they exchanged was enough. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it. A slight discomfort, almost unnoticeable, like a low warning in the back of her mind something wasn't right. And even without proof, without words, without any logical explanation, she already knew. That place was hiding more than it showed. And maybe she had just stepped into something she was never supposed to uncover. If you think this was intense, just wait until you find out what really led to that moment at the beginning. Drop a like and subscribe because what's coming next changes everything. Nia Brooks tried to ignore the feeling during the first few days. Change always brings discomfort. That's what she told herself while organizing routines, learning schedules, and paying attention to small details. But there were things that couldn't be explained by adjustment. The silence, for example, was different. It wasn't peace, it was absence. Like voices had been erased from that place a long time ago. Little by little, she began to understand the rhythm of the house. Fixed schedules, measured steps. Short conversations. Nothing ever slipped out of place, and to her that was already the first sign that something was wrong. Real places were imperfect. They had interruptions, laughter at the wrong time, small flaws. Here, everything felt rehearsed. Then came the details. The first one was almost insignificant, an object slightly out of place. A response that took just a second too long. A glance that avoided another glance, small crumbs. Too subtle to prove anything, but enough to bother someone who knew how to observe. That was when she started paying real attention. Not as an employee, but as someone who had seen patterns like this before. She noticed that the older woman rarely started conversations, and when she spoke, it felt like every word was carefully chosen, as if she were being heard even when she was alone. There were long pauses, interrupted sentences, and a kind of exhaustion that didn't come from the body but from somewhere deeper. She tried to get closer slowly, without invading, without pushing. A comment here, a light question there. A simple gesture. But every attempt met an invisible barrier. Not rejection, something worse, hesitation. Fear. And fear always has a reason. On the third day, something shifted. She walked into the room and felt it immediately. Nothing obvious. Everything in place, but wrong. A detail out of sync. She couldn't explain it at first. She just felt it. The air was heavier. Then she noticed the look. It wasn't empty. It wasn't sadness. It was alert, like someone waiting for something to happen again. At that moment she stopped doubting herself. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't adjustment. This wasn't exaggeration. It was a pattern. And patterns like that always hide something bigger. The problem was, the more she started to see, the clearer it became that someone in that house did not want any of it to be seen. And when you begin to notice what was meant to stay hidden, you also begin to become a problem. And she had no idea yet how dangerous that was going to be. Nia started observing in silence. She didn't ask direct questions, she didn't confront, she didn't react, she just watched. And the more she watched, the more the pieces began to come together. Not clearly, but enough to form a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The tense moments never happened in front of others. There was always a convenient absence, a gap, a space where no one else was around. That's when things shifted. The environment became colder, more rigid, more real. The older woman changed too. Not in obvious ways, but in details too small for anyone distracted to notice. The way her hand gripped the armrest tighter than necessary. The delay before answering something simple. The way her eyes avoided certain directions. That wasn't just fatigue. It wasn't natural fragility. There was control there, silent, constant, invisible to anyone who didn't want to see it. And then came the first real sign. While helping her change, a slight movement revealed something hidden. A faint bruise, placed in a way that didn't make sense for an accident, not fresh, but not old enough to ignore. It was in a specific place. The kind that doesn't just happen on its own. The silence that followed was heavier than anything said. She didn't comment. Not yet. But something shifted. The way she looked, the way she processed. That moment didn't go unnoticed. From somewhere beyond the doorway, there was a presence, and it didn't take long for the atmosphere of the house to adjust. As if it had sensed something slipping out of control, doors started closing more often, people appeared at the wrong times, conversations stopped when she got close. It was subtle but clear. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to. And in that moment, everything stopped being just suspicion. Now it was certainty. But certainty in a place like that came with a cost. And the closer she got to the truth, the more it became clear that someone would do anything to keep it buried. The shift was gradual but impossible to ignore. The house no longer felt just quiet, it felt watchful. Every step echoed differently. Every closed door carried intention, and for the first time since she arrived, Nia felt it clearly. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was being observed. Nothing had been said directly, but behavior changed. Access to certain spaces became limited, schedules were adjusted without explanation, and every time she got too close to the older woman, someone appeared. Too precise. Too timely to be coincidence. Still, she didn't stop. Not out of stubbornness, but because leaving now wouldn't fix anything. There was something happening in that house, and someone needed to see it through. It was during an ordinary afternoon that everything moved one step further. The hallway was too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't calm. It warns. The door wasn't fully closed, and that alone made her stop. A voice came from inside. Low. Not a conversation, control. The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Disguised threats. Pressure wrapped in calm tones. Conditions delivered with careful precision. And a response, barely audible on the other side, restrained, contained, slowly breaking. She didn't go in. Not then. But she didn't walk away either. She stood there, still, absorbing every fragment she could hear. Enough to confirm what she already knew, and worse, to understand that this went far beyond a single moment. It was constant. It was intentional. And it had been happening for far too long. When she finally stepped away, something inside her had changed. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It wasn't just suspicion. It was a decision. But decisions come with consequences. And in that place, choosing to act meant crossing a line that had no return. And someone was already waiting for her to do exactly that. The next day, nothing seemed different. And at the same time, everything was. The routine continued as if nothing had happened. Schedules were followed. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps echoed through the halls. But there was a new tension in the air, heavier, more present, like the entire house was waiting for the next move. She had changed too. Not on the outside. Her gestures were still precise. Her posture controlled. Her voice neutral. But internally, something had settled. She wasn't trying to understand anymore. She was looking for confirmation. And it came faster than expected. That morning, while helping with simple tasks, small signs became impossible to ignore. A slight flinch at touch, a quick glance toward the door before answering anything, a pause that lasted just a little too long when certain subjects came up. Fear doesn't disappear, it adapts. And that was fear. But this time it came with something else. Hesitation. Like behind the fear there was a desire to speak. Just not the courage yet. That's when she changed her approach. No pressure, no direct questions, just presence. She sat nearby in silence. Not as an employee. Not as someone expecting answers. But as someone who would stay even without them. Minutes passed and no words. Then, almost imperceptibly, a voice broke through. Low, controlled, like every word had to push through something invisible. You saw it, didn't you? The question didn't need an answer. What came next wasn't a full explanation, just fragments, small pieces of something much larger. Enough to form a picture that could no longer be denied. Control. Threats. Forced silence. And above all, isolation. When it ended, the room felt heavier. There were no tears, no dramatics, just truth. And truth, once spoken, changes everything. This was no longer suspicion. It was no longer personal perception. It was real. And that meant one thing. Staying there was no longer just a job, it was a risk. But leaving meant letting it continue. And as that decision began to take shape, one thing became clear. Someone else was starting to notice that the silence had been broken. From that moment on, things became harder to hide, not for the one causing it but for the one trying to protect. The behavior inside the house shifted in subtle ways, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but not to her. Presences started appearing at the wrong times. Interruptions came without reason. Doors that used to stay open were now always closed. It was control. And control reacts when it feels threatened. She understood that quickly. There was no more space to move freely. Every step had to be calculated. Every word measured. And even then, it was still risky. The connection built the day before hadn't gone unnoticed. The eyes that once avoided now watched. More often. More carefully, with intention. Then came the first indirect confrontation. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be pointed at as an accusation. Just a presence in the room. Firm, smiling, but without warmth. A conversation layered with hidden meaning. Simple questions asked casually but carrying weight behind them. Answers observed in silence. As if every detail was being tested. It was a game. And now she was part of it. But the real danger wasn't what was being said. It was what kept happening when no one was watching. That afternoon, something felt off again. An unusual delay, a moment that stretched too long. She noticed the absence first. The place where someone should have been empty. The hallway was too quiet. The door too closed. When she stepped inside, nothing looked chaotic. Nothing broken. Nothing obvious. But wrong. The position. The silence. The stillness. And something else. A small detail but impossible to ignore. The kind that confirms everything without a single word. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was repetition. And repetition means intention. Which meant this had happened before. More than once. Anger rose but not explosive. Not loud, steady. The kind that doesn't fade, it transforms. Still, acting wasn't simple. Not yet. Not like this. Because now there was something new at stake. She knew. And whoever was doing it was starting to realize that. And when both sides know, confrontation stops being a possibility. It becomes inevitable. After that, the silence was no longer the same. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was tension, compressed and ready to break at any moment. She knew she had to do something. But knowing wasn't enough. The real question was how. Making an accusation without proof meant losing everything. And worse, making things even more dangerous for someone already vulnerable. Still, pretending not to see was no longer an option. That night, a decision was made. She went to Han Jun. The space around him felt different. Organized, controlled, distant. He didn't seem like someone who dealt with chaos. Rather, someone who avoided looking directly at it. When she entered, his eyes lifted for a second, evaluating, calculating, expecting something simple. But it wasn't. The words came carefully. No exaggeration, no unnecessary emotion, just facts. What she had seen. What she had noticed. What could no longer be ignored. The silence that followed lasted too long. He didn't react immediately. He didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge, he just listened. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't what she expected. There was no shock, no anger, no urgency. There was doubt. Cold, rational doubt. Almost mechanical. Like he was analyzing a situation, not hearing a warning. The questions came. Many. But none about how to fix it. Only about certainty. About proof. About the possibility of being wrong. That was worse than denial. It was distance. And distance in that moment was what allowed everything to continue. When she walked out, one thing was clear. She was alone. The one person who could change everything didn't believe enough to act. And that made everything more dangerous. Because now it wasn't just against the one causing it. It was against a system that allowed it to continue. But going back wasn't an option anymore. She had spoken. And someone had listened. Even if they didn't fully believe. And in places like that, words don't disappear. They move. They spread. They reach where they shouldn't. And that same night, as the house returned to silence, a door opened just a little too slowly to be coincidence. The next morning, the atmosphere had changed. There were no raised voices that no open confrontation, but the tension was visible in every small detail too precise to ignore. Footsteps echoed more often. Doors closed with more force, and for the first time, no one pretended nothing was happening anymore. She felt it before she saw it. The gaze had changed. It was no longer passive observation. Now it was direct, constant, unhidden. Then came the first clear move. A simple instruction. A shift in routine. No explanation. No room for questions. Access restricted. Hours adjusted. Presence reduced to the bare minimum. It was a strategic withdrawal. But not to avoid conflict. To isolate. The less contact, the less interference. The less presence, the more control. But what they didn't expect was that it wouldn't push her away. It would make everything more obvious. Because when someone tries too hard to hide something, they end up revealing more than they should. That afternoon there was another absence. Longer than usual. Quieter than expected. This time she didn't hesitate. She ignored the new rules. Ignored the limits. And walked down the hallway anyway. Every step was a choice. Every second a risk. When she reached the door, her heartbeat wasn't racing. It was steady, decided. She turned the handle. What she found wasn't chaos. There were no screams. No struggle. It was worse. It was control. Absolute, cold, methodical control. The kind that leaves no obvious marks but destroys over time. For a second, everything froze. And in that moment, everything that had been building inside her finally reached its limit. There was no more room for doubt. No more space for strategy. Only one choice remained. Act, or allow it to continue. And as that thought settled, a gaze turned directly toward her. No surprise. No fear. As if it had been expected all along. As if this moment had been inevitable. And when two people face each other knowing exactly what's happening, the next step is no longer hidden. It becomes confrontation. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It was no longer hidden tension and no longer suspicion and no longer a subtle game of observation. Now it was open confrontation. No one spoke at first. But they didn't need to. The look said everything. On one side, someone who had finally decided not to step back. On the other, someone who had never been afraid to go too far. And in between, a presence that could no longer pretend not to understand. The break didn't come with shouting. There was no dramatic explosion. Not in that moment. It began in the smallest detail. A movement interrupted, an approach blocked, an order that wasn't followed. It was small, but final. Because in that second the dynamic shifted. Control was no longer absolute. And that was dangerous. Very dangerous. The response came fast. Not emotional, not uncontrolled, calculated short sentences delivered with quiet threat. Nothing that could be used against her. Nothing that left proof, but enough to make one thing clear. This wouldn't end there. And it didn't. That same night, the atmosphere of the house changed completely. The silence returned, but heavier than ever. Footsteps faded. Lights went out earlier. Doors stayed closed. It was as if everything was preparing. Or waiting. She didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but because she knew whatever was coming, it would come fast. And when it did, it wasn't a surprise. A sharp sound in the hallway. A movement out of place, an absence where there should have been presence. She stood up before thinking. Her body reacted first. Instinct already knew. As she crossed the hallway, there was no doubt left. No hesitation. It was happening now. This time there would be no watching, no strategy, no second chance. The door was slightly open, the scene about to repeat itself. But something was different. Because now, there was someone who wasn't going to stand there and watch. And the moment she pushed that door open, everything that had been held back finally broke. And that was exactly where the story returned to the moment it began. The door burst open. There was no hesitation anymore. No space left to think. The scene was right there, exactly as before, exactly as feared. The tension, the raised hand, the heavy silence before impact. But this time it didn't happen, because someone stepped in. Stop! The word came out firm, cutting through the air like something held back for too long. The movement froze midair. The gaze turned slowly. No surprise, no urgency. As if it had all been expected. You shouldn't be here. The voice came cold, controlled, almost bored. But there was no stepping back now. I saw everything. Silence. Not the same silence as before. This one carried weight. The kind that comes when truth is no longer hidden but spoken out loud. For a second, no one moved and no one breathed too loudly and no one tried to pretend. Then came the first step. Slow. Deliberate. The approach wasn't just intimidation, it was a test. How far would she go? The answer came without words. A step forward. A clear position. Between the threat and the one who couldn't defend herself. That was the moment everything shifted. Because when someone chooses to stand in the way, the conflict stops being invisible. It becomes unavoidable. The reaction came fast. Not loud. Not chaotic. But dangerous. Intentional. A sudden movement, an attempt to regain control. But this time it met resistance. The sound of impact echoed. Sharp. Loud. Final. The hand that once threatened pulled back. Balance broke for a second. The expression changed for the first time. And silence returned. But not the same. Now it carried consequence. Breathing grew heavier. The body trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of the choice made. Behind her, a slight movement. A different look. No longer hesitation and no longer silence. It was recognition. Someone had finally acted. But the moment didn't last. Because footsteps rushed down the hallway. Fast. Direct. And when the door opened again, the scene was complete. A body on the ground. A hand still tense in the air. A silent witness. And three versions of the truth about to collide. The silence that followed was heavy. Almost suffocating. Han Jun's gaze moved across the scene with precision. First the body on the floor. Then the hand still suspended in the air. And finally the figure in the wheelchair. No words at first. Only observation. She attacked me. The voice came too quickly. Too rehearsed. Tears appeared at the exact right moment. Breath breaking in a perfectly timed rhythm. But something didn't fit. This time it didn't fit. That's not true. The voice came from behind, weak, but steady enough to cut through everything. He turned slowly. For a moment, it looked like he didn't believe what he was hearing. Does that voice didn't usually speak. She hit me. Each word came with effort. But also with something new, decision. Silence returned. But now it carried something else. A break. His expression shifted. No longer doubt and no longer distance. Now attention. Then came the details. Small at first. Fragments. But enough to build something bigger. Repeated situations. Strange behavior. Moments that once seemed isolated now made sense. He didn't react immediately. But he didn't ignore it either. He took out his phone. A few taps. A pause. The screen lit up. I had cameras installed after the last renovation. The sentence landed in the room like something no one expected. The video started playing. And just like that, there was no more room for different versions. The room fell into complete silence as the footage spoke. Calculated movements. Repeated actions. Constant control. And finally the moment. The raised hand. The impact. And right after the interruption. When the video ended, no one needed to say anything. Because truth once seen cannot be denied. His gaze shifted again, but now completely different. No more doubt. No more hesitation. It's over. The words came low but final. And for the first time control had changed sides. What came next wasn't immediate. There was no explosion, no open chaos. There was silence. But a different kind of silence, not control but ending. Things began to move quickly, even if almost invisible. Calls were made. Doors were closed differently, presences disappeared. And the one who once dominated that space was no longer part of it. For the first time the house felt like it could breathe. No hidden tension, no constant surveillance, no weight pressing down on every step. It was subtle but real. The most visible change wasn't in the hallways, it was in the wheelchair. The gaze no longer avoided, no longer asked permission to exist. There was something there that hadn't been before, space, freedom, even if still fragile, but enough to be felt. And that changed everything. She stood there in silence. Not as an outsider, but as someone who had gone through all of it and stayed. Because she could have left. She could have chosen the easier path. But she didn't. And now she was there to see what came next. Han-jun had changed too. Not in dramatic ways. Not through big gestures. But in presence. He stayed longer, he looked more, paid attention in a way he hadn't before. As if he was finally seeing what had always been in front of him. The distance between them wasn't the same anymore. There was no rush, no immediate definition. But something was being built, without words, without needing to explain. Trust. And maybe something more. That afternoon the space felt calm in a new way. Light coming through the windows without resistance. The silence now light. She stepped closer, adjusting something gently, just like she always had. You stayed. The voice came stronger this time. A small smile appeared, almost unnoticed. I said I wouldn't leave. From across the room a gaze followed the moment. Not interrupting. Not interfering. But present. And for the first time that place no longer felt like control. Felt like a beginning. A new balance, a new dynamic, a place where no one had to stay silent anymore. Or run. And even if the past still existed, it no longer had power there. Because someone chose to act. And that changed everything. Now tell me. Do you know someone who has gone through something like this and no one noticed? Or worse, have you ever seen something wrong and didn't know if you should step in? If this story moved you in any way, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes one decision can be exactly what someone needs to not face everything alone.